The official record on dredge number 4 says it was a 3,000-ton gold dredge that sank twice. The second time, it stayed under for 30 years. It was the largest wooden-hulled bucket-line dredge ever built in North America. 8 stories of machinery resting on a hull of timber instead of steel. But a professional engineering account of this machine puts the number at 3. Neither account agrees water actually ended the machine's working life. Something quieter did that first. By November 1, 1959, the dredge had already stopped digging. It sat that winter on the pond it had spent decades hollowing out of Bonanza Creek, with no crew aboard and no one tending the dam. In the spring of 1960, that dam failed. Water moved in. The dredge went under a second time, and nothing about it, not its size, not the fortune already pulled from the ground, brought it back quickly. 30 years passed before anyone raised it. A construction engineering unit of the Canadian military finally did it, in 1990. Even that did not end the danger. 6 years after the machine was declared saved, it came within a measured fraction of an inch of going down again, on dry ground. Something had already beaten this machine once before, and it was not the water. What that was is where this story starts. If you enjoy these documentaries, then subscribe. Thank you. Now back to the gritty history. So why did the first recovery take 3 years, the second take 30, and why can even Parks Canada's own record not agree with a working engineer's report on how many times this machine actually went down? A machine built this heavy, at this cost, does not usually lose that kind of time or that kind of certainty to anything ordinary. Here is the fact that explains most of what follows, paid in full before anything else. Every part of this machine that mattered, the engines, the gearing, the bucket line, was shipped in from a foundry 2,000 miles away, in Ohio, and none of that imported steel ever touched solid ground again once it reached the Yukon. All 3,000 tons of it floated on wood. Wood absorbs water, swells, and rots. Steel, mostly, does not. That gap between what the machine was built from and what it floated on is what this story keeps pressing against, from the first year it worked to the last. By the early 1900s, the easy gold along the Klondike's creeks was already gone. Individual miners with pans and small sluice boxes had stripped the rich surface ground years earlier, and what was left, lower-grade gravel buried under frozen overburden, could not be worked by hand at a scale that still paid. A man with a shovel could only move so much ground in a day, and there was not enough of it left to make hand labor profitable at the volume the territory now needed. Industrial dredging let a single machine process what would have taken hundreds of miners years to work through by hand. That argument is why companies spent the early part of the century buying up small claims and folding them into blocks large enough to run a dredge across, and why American capital followed it north. Corporate interests, the Guggenheim-backed Yukon Gold Company among them, pushing Klondike mining toward exactly this kind of large corporate operation. The Canadian Klondike Mining Company, founded by Joe Boyle, was one of those companies, and in March of 1912 it signed a contract worth $134,800 for the machinery alone, the engines, the gearing, the bucket line, designed and built 2,000 miles away, at the Marion Steam Shovel Company in Marion, Ohio. That distance was the risk sitting underneath the entire investment. Every casting, every gear, every length of chain shipped north was money the company could not easily recover if a single piece failed to arrive or arrived broken, in a place with no foundry and no way to expedite a correction. Getting it to the claim meant a route with no straight line anywhere in it, by ship to Vancouver, north to Skagway, over the coastal mountains by rail to Whitehorse, then down the Yukon River by sternwheeler to Dawson City. From there, with no railway and no road built to carry that kind of weight, the final 100 tons went overland on sledges behind horse teams, in February, through the coldest stretch of a Yukon winter, to a claim on Bonanza Creek called 112 Below Discovery. It was the last, most exposed link in a chain 2,000 miles long, the heaviest remaining pieces on the leg with the fewest ways to recover from a mistake. Howard Brenner, the Marion engineer sent to oversee construction, stood on site through all of it, watching 2,000 miles of shipped machinery come together across one summer and winter. Neither he nor Boyle appears again in this story. No fate recorded for either man, no return visit, only a contract signed and a construction job finished, on schedule, by the spring of 1913. What that construction schedule also decided is the fact this entire story turns on. All of that imported steel had to sit on something, and it had to float, because the machine would spend its working life digging its own pond and dragging itself forward through it. Steel plate in that quantity did not exist anywhere near the Yukon, and shipping enough of it 2,000 miles, on top of everything already coming from Ohio, was not realistic in 1912. Timber, cut and assembled on site, was realistic, so that is what they built. 3,000 tons of American machinery, 8 stories tall, covering roughly 2/3 the footprint of a football field, resting its full weight on a hull of Yukon timber, floating in a pond it hollowed out for itself. Call it a standing bet instead of a design flaw, renewed every season that a material which absorbs water, swells, and rots could keep carrying a load it was never proven to hold indefinitely in a climate that never let it dry out completely between one year and the next. Keeping it watertight was never a one-time job. It meant routine pumping and inspection, a maintenance burden stitched into every working season on top of everything else the crew already managed. That hull held for 11 years. For those 11 years, the pattern did not change. A crew came on for an 8-hour shift, buckets climbing past at roughly 1 every 3 seconds, chain and steel grinding through the same loop hour after hour, and at the end of the shift, another crew relieved them while the machine kept moving underneath the handoff. Floodlights carried the night shifts through a winter darkness that could swallow most of the day at that latitude. 200 days a season, sometimes longer, cold enough that every metal handhold was its own small hazard, and nothing about any single shift looked different from the one before it. That repetition was the only thing the crew had any reason to trust. Then, in 1924, on the Boyle concession in the Klondike River Valley, 11 years into its working life, Dredge No. 4 sank. No surviving record gives a confirmed technical cause. No specific plank, no seam that opened, no single failure point that anyone wrote down and preserved. What the record agrees on is simpler and in its way colder. A machine that had floated and dug without incident for over a decade went under, on a concession named for the same man who had founded the company that built it. And, whatever explanation existed at the time, never survived to the present day. No inquiry report, no named cause, just a date, a location, and 3,000 tons of machinery sitting on the bottom of its own pond. Production stopped the day it went under, and stayed stopped. Wages tied to running the machine stopped with it. Whatever was still owed on the original $134,000 contract and on everything spent since kept accruing against a machine that was no longer earning anything toward it. And the longer 3,000 tons of waterlogged wood and steel sat where it fell, the more there was to worry about failing further before a crew even got back down to look at it. A sunk dredge does not hold still and wait to be convenient. It sits in water, in cold, exposed to exactly the conditions that had put it there. It stayed down for 3 years. 3 years is long enough to ask an obvious question: why not walk away from it, the way companies walked away from equipment that stopped earning its keep? The answer sits in what was still ahead of the dredge, not behind it. The ground still unworked in front of it was rich enough that leaving the machine idle indefinitely cost the company more than raising it did. But that kind of bet cuts both ways. Committing to raise 3,000 tons of sunken machinery meant risking real money on top of money already lost against a hull that had just proven it could fail, with no guarantee the same weakness would not take the machine down again the moment it went back in the water. Nobody left behind a step-by-step account of how the recovery itself was carried out. No record of how the hull was patched, or how 3,000 tons of waterlogged machinery was walked back onto a working footing. What survives is the outcome and the price. 3 years of lost production, spent on a bet that the ground ahead of the machine was worth the wait, made by people staring at a machine that had just shown them exactly what it was capable of losing. Whatever crew raised it worked through the same cold and the same frozen ground. That would make bringing the machine back a second time so much harder, decades later. In 1927, Dredge No. 4 went back to work, and the bet paid off, for now. One recovery answered, 3 years bought back by what was still waiting on the other side of it. The other recovery this story opened with, the one that took 30, has not happened yet. At Claim 67 below, near Hunker Creek, the dredge hit ground rich enough that on its best recorded day, it pulled roughly 800 ounces of gold, one 24-hour shift, worth somewhere north of $3 million at today's gold price, run by the same 4-man crew that worked every other shift. Nothing about the machine itself changed to make that possible. What changed was what was underneath it, and a number like that did not make anyone ease off the machine. It did the opposite. Ground that rich was exactly the kind of number that gave management every reason to keep pushing an aging dredge, one that had already gone under once, as hard as it could be pushed, for as long as the ground kept paying for it. Keeping pace with ground that rich meant running the machine at full design load, season after season. That meant transferring the punishment straight into the same hull that had already failed once. 66 buckets carried that load by the site's own current count. Other accounts put the number higher, into the low 70s. Nothing here settles which is right. Each one hauled more than 800 kilograms of gravel, 16 cubic feet at a time, chained together in a loop, climbing a digging ladder 107 feet long, at roughly 22 buckets a minute. That ladder could reach nearly 50 feet below the waterline the machine floated on and rise 17 feet above it. Run that pace across a full day and the machine processed close to 18,000 cubic yards of gravel, fed into a rotating screen called a trommel that tumbled it through water to wash the gold free before it reached the sluice tables. Even at full efficiency, those tables caught roughly 3/4 of the gold on the first pass and another fifth in a secondary system. A real share of everything the machine dug and hauled went back out with the tailings, lost, and nobody on the crew could do anything about it. 920 continuous horsepower, drawn as electricity off a river-fed plant, ran the system. The water needed to wash that gravel free traveled roughly 70 miles down a built ditch to reach it. At least once, the dredge did not stop at all. One stretch of continuous operation ran from the 1st of May through the 3rd of April the following year, 1919. 11 months digging through an entire Yukon winter with no scheduled day off. Controlling that much machine fell to 4 men at a time, trading 8-hour shifts, each one answering for a piece of the operation that could not be allowed to fail without warning. The dredge master ran the operation and, in winter, stood watch over the idle machine alone. The winchman worked the digging ladder itself, walking it forward inch by inch into ground the crew could not see through, feeling for the change in load that meant a jam was forming before the chain tore itself apart against frozen gravel. An oiler kept every moving joint lubricated while the machine ran, which meant climbing through it while it moved. A bow decker managed the bucket line, a stern decker watched the stacker flinging gravel out behind the hull, and a panner checked what the sluice tables had missed. None of that ran without cables strung across the pond, anchored on the far end to something the crew called the dead men. The dead men were not complicated. Buried timber and wire, anchor points reset by hand every time the machine advanced, giving the winches something solid to pull against. Unglamorous outdoor work in the cold, done by men whose names do not survive in the record, holding up a machine that could outproduce all of them combined. Around that 4-man core stood a bull gang of 3 to 5 men handling the cables and the dead men directly, and 2 steel spuds, pinning legs 60 feet long, anchoring the hull while the digging ladder swung against them. Pull the wrong one at the wrong moment, and there was nothing left to stop 3,000 tons of moving machinery from swinging into ground it had not been aimed at. No documented death or injury specific to this machine turns up anywhere in the record, across nearly 5 decades of moving steel that never paused for a shift change, cable under constant tension across a frozen pond, current feeding a plant that never fully powered down for 200 days at a stretch, and height on a digging ladder with nothing underneath it but water. Silence in a record built decades ago proves less than it sounds like it proves. It could mean the work was that clean. It could just as easily mean nobody wrote it down, and no one since has been able to ask. Whatever the crew absorbed, the hull absorbed alongside them, season after season, in ways nobody was measuring at the time. Wood, unlike steel, does not simply wear. It takes on water, dries, swells again with meltwater, and freezes solid through the winter, and every one of those cycles worked at the timber a little more than the last one had, on top of the vibration of a bucket line running around the clock, hour after hour, for 200 days a season. Engineered for exactly that pace, the machine still only crept roughly half a mile across a full working season, wearing at its own foundation the entire way it advanced. By the late 1930s, that accumulated damage had become its own kind of emergency, not a flood, not a sudden failure, just a hull that had absorbed 27 years of punishment it was never built to take indefinitely, and a company now facing the cost of doing something about it before the ground made the decision instead. In 1940, Yukon Consolidated Gold Corporation dismantled Dredge No. 4 completely and rebuilt it on the same ground at Bonanza Creek. That decision was, first, an admission. The original hull had become too great a liability to keep running, and taking an 8-story industrial plant apart to give it a new body was cheaper, in the long run, than continuing to gamble on the one it had. An entirely new wooden hull, an entirely new superstructure, built and reassembled around machinery already working for 27 years, took the better part of a year, and the dredge earned nothing while it sat through the work. Every dollar spent rebuilding it was a dollar the new hull would now have to earn back before the machine turned a profit again. A separate engineering account of this same machine, written decades later by 2 credentialed conservation engineers, describes something else happening not long before this rebuild, another sinking, in 1939. Parks Canada's own chronology does not list one anywhere. It will not be the last place the record disagrees with itself either. The strangest version of that argument is still ahead, waiting at the machine's next sinking. What did not get replaced was almost everything mechanical inside the new hull. The same gearing, the same engines, some of the same steel that had come off sledges behind horse teams in February of 1913. The dredge that returned to work in September of 1941 was, underneath a body less than a year old, substantially the same machine Howard Brenner had watched come together on Claim 112 below Discovery almost 30 years earlier. The wooden body wore out and got replaced. The imported machinery inside it, shipped from a foundry 2,000 miles away before the First World War had even started, kept going, still resting, exactly as before, on wood. For most of the next 2 decades, that arrangement held, and the costs kept stacking underneath it the same way they always had. The original contract, the 3 years of lost production after 1924, whatever the recovery itself had cost, the better part of a year's rebuild in 1940, and now the ordinary running costs of an aging plant, none of which ever went backward. So what finally stopped a machine capable of that kind of production? If it was not the water, and it was not the wood, gold's price was fixed. Under the international monetary system in place from 1934 onward, an ounce sold for $35, no matter what it cost to dig up, how deep the machine had to reach, or how far the water traveled down the Yukon ditch to wash it free. That number did not move for the rest of the dredge's working life. Everything on the other side of the ledger did move. Labor costs climbed year over year. The richest, easiest gravel within reach of the dredge's position had already been worked through decades earlier, first by hand, then by this very machine. What was left cost close to as much to process as it paid back. Inside the company office, not on the bow deck, the arithmetic was simple, and it never favored the machine. Every season, the same fixed number sat on one side of the page. Every season, the number on the other side grew: wages, maintenance, the cost of running the electric plant, while the ground ahead of the machine got thinner. At some point, the two numbers crossed, and no amount of skill running the winch could change the outcome after that. A dredge master who had kept the machine profitable for 30 years could not outproduce arithmetic, any more than a winchman could outlift a jammed bucket line by pulling harder. A machine that could still process 18,000 cubic yards of gravel a day was, by the late 1950s, doing that work against ground that barely covered what it cost to run. Dredge No. 4 was not alone in that. The same fixed price and thinning ground were closing in on every dredge operation like it across the territory, which is part of why 12 dredges eventually worked the Klondike goldfields in total, and why none of them were still running by 1966. It stopped on the 1st of November 1959, the way an operation stops when the numbers no longer support running it. No accident behind it, no storm, just a crew finishing the season's work and going home. A dredge this size never employed only the 4 men who ran it. Around that core crew stood a company workforce that had once run as high as roughly 300 people through the working season. Cable crews and ditch maintenance among them. Every one of those wages exactly the kind of cost that kept climbing on the side of the ledger allowed to move. No single record spells out what happened to each of them. What the record supports plainly is that a shutdown this size emptied out the jobs built around it, all at once, on a single date, for a workforce whose entire income had depended on a machine that could sink, or be shut down by arithmetic, or both. That is what had already happened, 5 months before the water came back. It recontextualizes everything before it, but it does not finish the story. The dredge still had to go under a second time. It still had to stay buried for 30 years. Somebody still had to work out how to raise 3,000 tons of rotted machinery out of frozen ground, and none of that has happened yet. What changes, from here, is what the flood was about to walk into. A machine with no crew, no dam maintenance, and, for the first time in its working life, nothing ahead of it valuable enough to make anyone hurry. Then, in the spring of 1960, the dam gave way. The dredge had sat through that first winter and into spring on the pond it had spent decades hollowing out of Bonanza Creek, with nobody aboard and nobody maintaining the dam that held the pond's water level. A dam built to serve an active operation stays just as necessary once the operation stops, more necessary if anything, with nobody left to watch it. That spring, it failed. Water moved into the pond and the ground around it, and the dredge, sitting idle and unmanned, moved with it. One account describes the collapse rotating the hull a full 180 degrees and lifting it clear off the shelf it had settled onto. 3,000 tons of wood and steel turning on a flooded pond, nobody there to feel it happen, coming to rest, facing a direction it had never been built to face. Another account describes something slower, a 45-degree rotation across repeated spring runoffs over the following 2 decades, the hull sinking a little deeper into silt each time rather than all at once. Both agree on what came after, however fast it started. The machine went down, and the same seasonal cycle that had shaped every working year of its life, a trickle through summer, a torrent every spring, kept pushing it deeper, with no crew left each spring to bail, pump, or push back. Unlike 1924, there was no crew stepping off the hull an hour ahead of it, no shift ending the way every other shift had for 11 straight years. The entire event happened to an empty machine, on a pond nobody was watching that spring. No newspaper coverage of the failure survives in the sources gathered for this account, the same way none survived for 1924. A company dam gave way on company property nobody was actively working, and whatever reaction followed never made it into anything that lasted. Nobody came looking. That is the colder fact sitting underneath this sinking, worse in its own way than the water itself. A machine that had once justified a 3-year emergency now went under with no one even watching it happen. And the recovery that finally does come for it, 30 years on, will not close the danger either. 6 years after Parks Canada declares the machine saved, it comes within a fraction of an inch of proving that wrong. Here is where the record stops agreeing on something more basic than how fast it happened. Parks Canada's own institutional history, the Federal Heritage Record, the site's current official pages, the Engineering Society's historic site documentation, all count 2 sinkings for this machine, 1924, and this one, caused by the dam failure in 1960. That 2 sinking count is the version most histories of this machine repeat, and it is the version behind the title's own claim. But the same professional engineering account that flagged a disputed sinking back in 1939 carries that disagreement through to the end. In that version, Dredge No. 4 sank in its own pond in 1924, was refloated in 1927, sank again in 1939, and then sank a 3rd time in 1959. Not because a dam burst, but because there was no one left to pump the bilges once the crew was gone. No dam appears anywhere in their version of the ending. 2 credentialed engineers describing the same machine count 3 sinkings where the institutional record counts 2 and disagree on what actually caused the last one. Neither account is unsourced. Neither is obviously wrong. I will say this plainly: a professional engineering paper does not invent a sinking, and neither does a federal heritage record. The record on this specific machine disagrees with itself, and nothing available today resolves which version is right. The title you clicked on says twice. At least one professional engineering source says 3, and this account is not going to pretend that gap is settled. What is not in dispute is what happened over the years that followed. Every spring runoff pushed the hull deeper into the silt it had settled into. By the time excavation finally began, crews found it under roughly 18 feet of ice, silt, and mud, the accumulated weight of about 30 winters and 30 spring runoffs, packed solid around a hull that had already spent nearly 50 years working before it went under. Nobody moved to recover it for a decade after the dam failed. A machine that had once justified a 3-year rescue sat through the entire 1960s without one. There was no version of the 1924 calculation running in anyone's head this time, no rich ground waiting on the other side to make the arithmetic point toward rescue. A protective berm went up around the site in 1983, more to slow the damage than reverse it. In 1970, while the dredge still sat exactly where the flood had left it, somebody had already settled who owned it, if not what to do with it. Dredge No. 4 was sold. Not scrapped, not abandoned. Sold. To Parks Canada for $1. Set that figure next to the other number attached to this machine. Across 46 combined years of operation, Dredge No. 4 had helped produce something in the neighborhood of 9 tons of gold, worth roughly $9 million at the fixed price it was mined under. A machine that had generated that kind of return changed hands for exactly $1, because by 1970, what came attached to owning it was a 3,000-ton liability, sunk, rotting, buried under a creek that flooded every spring. On land, nobody had any commercial use for. The dollar was what was left of the machine's value once everything it cost to keep had been subtracted from everything it might still be worth. A figure that had fallen, across 10 years of silt, from $9 million to nothing. Owning it now meant owning the same permafrost, the same silt, and the same creek that had put it there. It would sit for another 20 years before anyone tried to bring it back up. 20 years of nothing. Then, in 1990, somebody finally came for it. The job went to Parks Canada, working alongside the 1st Construction Engineering Unit of the Canadian Armed Forces. The company that built and ran this machine for 46 years had raised it once already, in 1927, with its own crew and its own money, chasing gold still waiting on the other side of the rescue. This time there was no gold waiting on the other side of anything. Raising it now meant raising a preserved artifact, not a working asset. and it took a military engineering unit to do a job the company itself had once managed alone. What they were looking at in 1990 was 3,000 tons of wood and steel that had not floated in 30 years, packed into permafrost, buried under silt that had spent 3 decades compacting around every seam in the hull. No amount of patching was going to fix that on its own. Frozen ground does not move on a construction schedule. It moves when the ground decides to let go. Timber that has spent 30 years waterlogged does not necessarily hold its shape the moment the weight pressing it into place comes away. Every foot of excavation risked exposing wood that had been structurally supported by packed silt for 3 decades and might not carry its own weight the instant that support was removed. There was no way to test any of that from the outside either. A hull that looks intact under 30 years of frozen silt can still be a shell holding its shape only because the ground around it has not let it move yet. Pull that silt away too fast or in the wrong order, and the same structure that survived 3 decades underground can fail the moment it is finally freed from whatever had been holding it together. That risk did not go away once the machine cleared the ground. It followed the hull through every stage that came after, all the way to the first moment it took its own weight on water again. The sequence the record preserves runs in 4 stages, and each one depended entirely on the last one going right. First, the crews dug the silted-in pond back out. The same pond the dredge had hollowed for itself decades earlier, now packed solid and needing to be excavated all over again before there was anywhere for the machine to float at all. That alone meant moving 30 years of frozen sediment off a hull nobody could yet see the true condition of, without knowing whether the ground coming away would take a rotted section of timber with it. Second, they cleaned out the hull itself, clearing 3 decades of accumulated silt and mud from a structure that could not be stressed unevenly without risking further damage to timber already weakened by rot, working, in effect, inside a 3,000-ton container whose walls nobody could fully inspect from the outside. Remove the packing on one side faster than the other, and the hull could settle unevenly under its own weight before anyone had a chance to correct it. Third, they refloated it. For 30 years, water had been the thing that buried this machine deeper every spring. Now the same buoyancy that had carried the hull since 1913 was the only realistic way to move it at all, coaxed back into doing its job on a structure nobody could risk lifting by force. Refloating a hull this size meant trusting rotted wood to take on load evenly, all at once, for the first time in 3 decades, and there was no way to rehearse that moment before it happened. Fourth, once it was up, they set it back down, deliberately, onto cribbing built at a new site, on higher ground, clear of the flood cycle that had caught it the first time. Setting 3,000 tons of waterlogged timber down unevenly could crack a hull that had just survived being freed from 30 years of frozen ground. The most dangerous moment of the entire operation was arguably the very last one, the one that looked, from the outside, like the job was already finished. Nobody involved could promise, at the start, that a hull this rotted would hold together through all 4 stages. The record does not preserve a day-by-day account of how the crews managed it, no equipment list, no log of what nearly went wrong. What survives is the sequence itself, and the difficulty implied by every stage of it. Permafrost that does not cooperate on anyone's schedule, timber that had not held its own weight since 1960, and a machine that had to be handled as carefully coming out of the ground as it had once been dangerous going into it. The operations commanding officer, Captain, later Major, Jones, is recorded making one dry joke about the scale of what his unit had just been handed. Raising Dredge No. 4, he said, made it the largest ship the Army had ever sailed. Dredge No. 4 had never been a ship. It had floated only in its own pond, on a river it never touched. But bringing it up out of 30 years of frozen ground took something closer to a naval salvage operation than an ordinary construction job, handled by men trained to move equipment across water, not excavate a rotted hull from frozen ground and hope it survived its own weight. The joke lands because it is true in every way except the literal one, and it is the only line attributed to anyone from either recovery. Between 1991 and 1992, Dredge No. 4 came up. It moved roughly 13 kilometers to its current site along Bonanza Creek Road, on ground high enough to keep the next spring runoff from doing what the last one had done. 30 years after the dam gave way, the machine that had once advanced half a mile in a full working season covered 13 kilometers in one engineered push. It has not been in the water since. One recovery down at 3 years. One down at 30, with a military engineering unit doing what the original company had once done for itself out of its own pocket. Whether getting it upright was actually the end of the danger is a different question, and the record answers it within 6 years. For a while it looked finished. Tour buses came. Visitors walked the same bow deck a 4-man crew had once worked in 8-hour shifts, looking at a machine that had survived a flood, 30 buried years, and a full military salvage operation, sitting solid on ground that did not flood. Nobody watching those tours had reason to think the danger was over. The gantry looked the way it had looked in every photograph taken of it since 1913. Recovering the dredge had only moved the danger somewhere new, into the wooden half of the machine, and a cable system nobody was watching closely enough. In 1993, with the machine finally sitting safely on high ground, site staff made a small maintenance decision. They lifted the end of the digging ladder onto a pressure-treated wood support, taking the load off the cables that normally carried it. Routine care, it looked like, for machinery that no longer needed to dig. The ladder depended on 2 cable systems, standing rigging, which held its weight around the clock, and running rigging, the adjustable cables that had once raised and lowered it while it worked. Nobody thought the running rigging still mattered once the ladder stopped moving. Slackening it should have been harmless. Instead, the weight it had still been carrying came to rest where it was never built to sit, on the standing rigging and on the timber struts connecting the gantry to the superstructure. Rotting wood does not announce that it is carrying more than it should. It keeps failing, quietly, until somebody measures it. By the summer of 1996, somebody finally did. Kathleen Murphy, a marine and industrial conservation engineer, and Alex Barbour, a heritage millwright, had assessed the site in 1993, and structural engineer Lise Blanchet had checked it again in 1995. When Murphy and Barbour returned that summer, they found the bow gantry, the tower the digging ladder hangs from, in the early stages of actual collapse, visibly worse than 1995 and much worse than 1993. The compression struts connecting the gantry to the superstructure showed severe rot. A crack ran through the upper end of the portside strut. A joint the engineers called the knuckle was moving forward, measurably, at 1/4 of an inch every 2 days. Not old damage, but something getting worse while they stood there measuring it. The sheaves, the pulley wheels the rigging ran through, had seized solid, leaving the system no way to redistribute its own load. For engineers who found nothing alarming in 1993, watching it move measurably 3 years later meant whatever margin the gantry once had was already gone. Parks Canada shut the dredge to visitors and treated it as an emergency. What the team built to track the movement came almost entirely from a hardware store. 10-pound spring-loaded fishing scales clipped across the cracks as makeshift deflection gauges, read daily by project manager Pat Habelook. Dental floss pulled bar-tight beside the standing rigging cables. The sag measured to track tension loss. A surveyor's total station, run by Robbie Van Rumpt, tracking 24 points on the structure. None of it was built for this job. All of it worked. The fix compressed 7 planned stages into whatever the structure would tolerate. Extra support columns went in first, under the joints failing fastest, buying time rather than solving anything. The team tried freeing the seized sheaves by heating and hammering them loose. It did not work. The attempt itself triggered the 1/4 inch in 2 days movement that told them, mid-repair, exactly how close the structure already was to giving. A mid-height stay went in next, tensioned with improvised Spanish windlasses because the hydraulic jacks the team wanted were not available near Dawson City. Then came the most delicate step, backing off the standing rigging's own tension, turn by turn, checked against the total station each time, bringing the load down from an estimated 90 tons to about 65, too fast, and whatever was left holding the struts together could have failed under the sudden shift. Too slow, and the struts might not have lasted the 2 days it took. A steel box beam went in beneath the struts as a backstop, muscled into place on an improvised roller and scaffold rig because no crane in Dawson City could reach it. Last, a forestay cable ran from the gantry to the tip of the digging ladder as a final restraint, and before anyone trusted it, the rigging crew proof-tested the hardware by hanging a real dredge bucket from it. 4,600 pounds of cast steel, exactly the load it would have to carry. By the paper's own account, written not long after, the emergency measures were still standing. A permanent rebuild of the gantry had specifications drawn up and was out for tender, scheduled to start in May of 1997. What happened after that is not in the record available here. No source confirms whether the permanent fix went ahead or whether the emergency stabilization simply held on its own. That is an honest gap, not a broken promise. What is certain is what already happened. A machine that took 30 years and a military engineering unit to save nearly went back down 6 years later, over a maintenance decision nobody thought was dangerous, caught and held by a handful of named people working with dental floss, fishing scales, and a surveyor's instrument. Dredge No. 4 still sits on that high ground along Bonanza Creek Road today, recognized now as a National Historic Site of Canada, open to be walked through by anyone who wants to see what a company from Ohio and a workforce of a few hundred people built out of timber and imported steel in 1912. The permafrost underneath it has not stopped moving, and the timber that spent 30 years frozen and waterlogged has not stopped needing attention either. The first time Dredge No. 4 went under, it came back in 3 years because a fortune of gravel was still waiting on the other side of the rescue. The second time it stayed down for 30 because that fortune was already spent and nobody came looking. Getting it back up after that took a military engineering unit and 4 stages nobody had tried on this machine before. None of it ended the danger. 6 years later, a maintenance decision nobody had flagged as dangerous put the same machine within a 1/4 inch, measured every 2 days by hand, of coming down a third time on dry land, long after everyone had been told it was safe.